Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about the reason why the government has cut the funds for the MGNREGA scheme. We also talk about an RSS-affiliated magazine pushing for the implementation of the Uniform Civil Code. But first, we talk about the Victoria Gowri controversy. On Tuesday, 5 new additional judges were added to the Madras High Court. And one of them was the 49-year-old advocate L. Victoria Gowri. And it is her appointment that became controversial. Because over the past few years, she has been accused of hate speech and making objectionable remarks against minority communities. And in addition to this, Gowri's name also stood out because she has been a former member of the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party. Now, after her name was recommended for this position, a group of lawyers from the Madras High Court wrote to the President and the Supreme Court Collegium asking that her name should be withdrawn. In this segment, we speak to Indian Express's Apurva Vishwanath, who writes on law for the paper, about this controversy and why the Supreme Court eventually rejected the pleas challenging Gowri's appointment. Okay, so Apurva, we understand that the Supreme Court Collegium recommends people to be appointed in the high courts, and the centre then approves these names. So could you talk about what happened in the case of Victoria Gowri? What led to her appointment?
So on 17th of January, the Supreme Court recommended a bunch of names for appointment as High Court judges. There were some names recommended for the Karnataka High Court, about 8 names for the Madras High Court. Incidentally, on the same day, the Supreme Court also reiterated some of their earlier recommendations. And this was sort of an unprecedented reiteration where the Supreme Court Collegium made public the reasons as to why the government had red flagged them. Interestingly, one of those names is actually from the Madras High Court of Advocate R. John Satyan. And in Satyan's case, the government had red flagged that he had some critical views of the establishment. And in fact, he had shared an article that was critical of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And he had expressed some views about the medical entrance exam NEET following the suicide of a girl in Tamil Nadu. So all of these were issues that were red flagged. And on the same day, the Madras High Court, other names were recommended for appointment as judges of the High Court. So these two things are happening simultaneously. And it came to light subsequently that Victoria Gowri, a senior advocate, a counsel for the central government, has actually been a active member of the Bharatiya Janata Party. Her political affiliations are very open. You know, her Twitter profile said she's Chowkidar Victoria Gowri. And, you know, there were photographs of her with the law minister. And also a bunch of interviews and comments that she'd made, things that she had said on Twitter were about minorities, about politics of this country. There was so much political conversation, and her overt political affiliations became a topic of conversation, of course, because on one hand, this government red flags Satyan or Bombay High Court advocate Somshekhar Sundaresan for their views that are in public domain. But overt political affiliations was not a problem for anybody. The collegium recommended this name, and within just a couple of weeks, the government has even processed and appointed her as a judge of the High Court.
Right, and this is why the bar took this issue up with the collegium and said that her views regarding minority communities were problematic. But then when they didn't hear back from the collegium, the group of lawyers approached the Supreme Court regarding this. And senior advocate Raja Ramchandran was the one representing the petitioners in this case. And he mentioned the matter to the Chief Justice. What happened after that?
So the Chief Justice did agree to hear it and said we will hear it by the end of the week. But right after that, Law Minister Kiran Rijiju tweeted that these recommendations had been accepted and Victoria Gowri was appointed a judge of the Madras High Court. So again in the afternoon at 2 p.m. when the court sat, Ramachandran mentioned again, sought an urgent hearing. And at that point, the Chief Justice also disclosed that, you know, the collegium is considering this additional material which has come to their knowledge after the recommendation has been made. And the Chief Justice said that, you know, he would constitute a bench and the hearing would happen the next day. So even at night, there was this sort of question about whether the hearing would happen before Gowri would take oath as judge of the Madras High Court. Because finally, when the case was listed in the cause list, it showed that the case would be heard as item number 38, which would be that in this, according to serial number, it would come up as a 38th case before the court. And by then, the oath ceremony would have been over. Very late in the night on Monday, the Madras High Court issued a circular that the oath would take place at 10:30 in the morning. But the petitioners also questioned this because, when the Supreme Court was seized of the matter and when they said that there would be an urgent hearing, should the Madras High Court have issued a circular going ahead with the oath for this particular judge? But, legally there is no bar. The Madras High Court acting Chief Justice is acting because the presidential warrants of appointment have been issued, and that's the protocol that follows, right? The oath is the consequence of the warrants being issued by the President of India. But at 10:15 in the morning, the hearing begins, and while the hearing is underway, the judges had expressed a preliminary view that they might not entertain this issue, and if they did, it would open a can of worms, and there were all of these indications from the judges that this is a dead end. But while the hearing was underway, at 10:46, Victoria Gowri took oath as judge of the Madras High Court. And I think the hearing concluded a few minutes after that, which is maybe at 10:50, with Justice Sanjeev Khanna saying the writ petition is dismissed and the reasons would follow.
I, Lakshmana Chandra Victoria Gowri,
having been appointed as additional judge of the High Court of Madras,
having been appointed as additional judge of the High Court of Madras,
do swear in the name of God
do swear in the name of God
that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of India as by law established,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of India as by law established.
And Apurva, this seems to be a pretty unique situation. Have we seen a case like this before when an appointment has been challenged like this?
Since we've had the collegium system of appointment of judges, a case like this is perhaps for the first time. There has been an instance in the past where, an appointment was challenged and the Supreme Court actually struck it down right before the judge was to take his oath. But that we're talking about the pre-collegium days where the appointment was actually done by the executive and the Supreme Court had no say over it. But the collegium's own recommendation, this is happening for the first time for an appointment. We've had some in the past, where an elevation as a Chief Justice, for example, or elevation to the Supreme Court is challenged, but this sort of seeking a stay on the oath of a judge. And, this was all happening almost minutes before the judge was supposed to take oath, right? So this level of scrutiny on a decision of the collegium is perhaps happening for the first time.
Okay, and in this case, the Supreme Court dismissed the plea. But what was the reason they gave for it? Because it did appear to be a tricky situation.
Yes, so it's obviously a complex issue, right? There are 3 judges of the Supreme Court, including the Chief Justice of India, who formed the collegium. Initially, when a bench was constituted, Justice M.M. Sundaresh was part of it. He happens to be a consultee judge. Now, the Chief Justice and the collegium, the consultee judge, all of this process happens behind the scenes, which is shrouded in opacity. There's very little information available in public domain on what is the material before the Supreme Court collegium. Did the collegium know that, she was a member of the BJP? Did the collegium overrule any objections by the state government or the central government? All of these questions remained unanswered. So now, in the absence of these answers, you have 2 judges sitting in their judicial capacity. And what was before them was to sit in judgment over a decision of the collegium, a decision of the Chief Justice of India in a way. So as soon as the hearing commenced at 10 o'clock, he made it very clear. The question before us is not about suitability of a candidate. It is about the eligibility of a candidate. The bench was very clear that they didn't want to go into the subjective arguments on whether she deserves to be a judge. Could there have been a better candidate? None of those questions. But does she objectively qualify to be a judge?
And was there a possibility that the Supreme Court could have stayed Victoria Gowri's appointment?
So once the oath has taken place, what are the options before the Supreme Court? And this is also something that the judges themselves said during the hearing. Justice Gowri is appointed as an additional judge of the High Court, which is a sort of a probationary period for about 2 years. We've had several instances in the past where an additional judge has not been subsequently made a permanent judge of the High Court, right? So just a couple of years ago, there was a Bombay High Court judge in Nagpur. After like a performance review on some of her judgments, the collegium decided not to appoint her as a permanent judge of the Bombay High Court. So the Justice Pushpa Ganeriwala, in fact, resigned a day before her term as an additional judge was coming to an end. So there are instances like that. So what the court also indicated today was that those are still options available, right? It's not as if everything is over. But as of today, what the petitioners were asking for was this undue haste. And when this matter was mentioned yesterday, the Chief Justice admitted that there was some additional information that had been noticed by the collegium and they were looking into it. So the petitioners were asking really for a fighting chance. Or is the collegium looking into it? And if the collegium is looking into it, can you ask the government or can you just ask the oath to be deferred or just stayed for the time being?
And Apurva, as someone who has been reporting on the collegium for some time now, did any of these developments come as a surprise to you?
You know, the questions about the collegium, not just its efficacy, but its processes, that the whole system is shrouded in opacity, that these are a bunch of decisions, very significant, crucial decisions that are taken behind closed doors by a bunch of 3 or 4 judges. These are all conversations we've been having time and again. And what we saw play out in the last 2 days is exactly that, a result of all of this. So the symptoms are the same. And you know, you've had an outcome that's so undesirable now. So the judges hearing the case are also caught between a rock and a hard place, because if they had to agree with the petitioners, that would be passing judicial orders against the collegium, which is headed by the Chief Justice of India. If they decide not to do anything about it, it is sort of accepting this public scrutiny. So it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of a situation that we saw play out.
And next we talk about MGNREGA, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which provides unskilled jobs to millions of people every year. According to the Act, the government is supposed to provide 100 days of guaranteed employment in a year to any rural household at minimum wages. The jobs under it can involve anything from building watersheds and roads to planting trees and even constructing houses. Now, during the budget, which was announced earlier this month, the allotment for the scheme was severely cut. At 60,000 crore rupees, its budget is the lowest it has been in 6 years. In this segment, Indian Express's rural affairs editor Harish Damodaran joins us to talk about the rationale behind this move and his biggest takeaway from it. Harish, before we talk about what happened in the budget this time, could you begin by talking about why MGNREGA was introduced in the first place?
Yeah, MGNREGA was a program which was started by the previous UPA government in 2005. I think it kicked off from February 2006 onwards. And it wasn't deployed much by the Modi government. Okay, maybe because it was identified with the previous regime. But I'll say that it was used very effectively during the time of the pandemic, 2020, 2021, and 2022. These 3 financial years, it generated record number of jobs. And along with the free food scheme, I think these 2 were the most effective social safety nets that were deployed during the time of the pandemic and also in the aftermath of the war. And probably the 2 schemes together, the MGNREGA plus the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana, the free food scheme. These 2 things, I think, were the most effective social safety nets during the pandemic and this period. And it provided a lot of protection to the people who were most vulnerable to these shocks.
Right, and that's what you mean by these schemes being safety nets.
Yeah, I would say that these were the 2 basic schemes. Unlike, say, Western countries, say the US or Europe, where the populations got, cash transfers. In the case of India, it was basically these two schemes, basically the PDS and MGNREGA, which delivered the maximum, you can say, income. It provided the real poor and the vulnerable some protection against job losses, income losses, etc.
And Harish, the allocation for the MGNREGA scheme was sharply reduced in the budget this time to a 6-year low, in fact. Could you talk about what was the reason for that?
Yeah, I think if you read the economic survey's opening chapter is titled Recovery Complete. So I think the Modi government's entire calculations is that, look, I mean, we have come out of the worst of the pandemic, and we have also figured out how to adjust to the war. Also global prices and all, which had shot up through the roof when the Russian invasion started during that period, like March to about May 2022, when global prices of everything rose. The prices have come down. I mean, they are still elevated, but the economy has kind of, adjusted to the oil and the fertilizer prices, etc. Anyway, the job markets are back. The economy has recovered. I mean, that is the calculation of the government, that 2023-24 is going to be better than 2022-23 and 2021-22, etc. So therefore, we don't need these programs. Or even if we have, it doesn't have to be as aggressively deployed as it was during those 3 years.
And what was this calculation based on, that this year will be better than the recent ones?
I would say it is, to some extent, it's an assumption. Though I think there are about 2-3 indicators which show that, probably the economy is kind of normalizing. For example, rural wages, the growth, I think in November was about 6.4%, in nominal terms. And inflation that month was about 6.1%. So which means in real terms, the wages have started growing. So that is one indicator. The second is actually your two-wheeler sales are showing growth. And two-wheeler sales are mostly sold in rural areas and small towns and all. So unlike the previous year where you saw the two-wheeler sales falling, whereas, you had high-end cars, etc., their sales were growing. So it looks like there is some kind of a recovery in sales of two-wheelers also. And number 3 is tractor sales. Since September, there's been very good growth of tractor sales. So that again is probably some indicator that in the rural economy, there is some growth happening. And we had a decent Kharif harvest. That is a crop which was sown after the monsoon. So the Kharif harvest was decent. And right now, the Rabi crop looks good. The wheat, mustard, chana, etc. Because we've had a good winter and farmers have sown much more area. So suppose even the Rabi crop also is good, then we have some kind of a total recovery. I mean, I won't use the words like recovery complete, which is what the economic survey has said. But there's been some kind of a recovery. And so if you're returning to a normal year, if the next year is going to be a normal year, you don't need extraordinary mitigation measures.
And earlier you mentioned tractor sales. Could you talk a bit more about that and tell us why that is a good prediction for the recovery?
No, see, tractor sales means probably farmers had a good harvest this time, right? I mean, especially I think in central India, cotton, soybean, groundnut, the harvests were good. And plus the prices were also good. So that indicates that there is better farm income. And plus there was not much damage. Last year we had a lot of crop damage because of excess rains. So this year, we have not had any adverse weather events so far. Only you had some deficiency of monsoon in UP, Bihar, Bengal, etc. initially, right? But since then, there's not been any weather shock, unlike in 2021-22, which was really the year of climate change for India, right? I mean, you had excess rains and plus you had March temperatures shooting up. So we don't know what is going to happen now. And we still have about 2 months left for the wheat to be harvested. And if it turns out to be good, then I think we will have some kind of a recovery in rural areas.
Okay, so the government seems to think or hope that this year will be better. But is that just based on the assumption that India would no longer be impacted by the Ukraine war and other global factors?
Yeah, see, but if you see all the past years, they provided much less initially for MGNREGA, for the food subsidy, etc. But they ended up providing more. They ended up spending more. So nothing stops the government from increasing the provision for MGNREGA later in the year. In fact, we can expect that the government will spend more money, not necessarily in MGNREGA, but maybe in the Pradhan Mantri PM Kisan. Basically, you have the scheme which gives farming households about 6,000 rupees per year. Maybe that can be increased to, say, 9,000 rupees ahead of election. So I think one shouldn't take the budget estimates at this point very seriously. And we can assume that the provisions will go up later on because since it's in the run-up to the elections. And I don't think we have seen the end of the allocations.
And finally, we talk about the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or the RSS, the ideological parent of the BJP. In the latest edition of an RSS-linked magazine called the Indraprastha Samvad, an editorial pushed for the implementation of the Uniform Civil Code, or UCC, the idea that there should be one single law that would decide how personal matters like marriage, divorce, inheritance, or adoption are governed, regardless of someone's religion. In the past, many in the minority have been critical of this idea because they fear that this single law will be skewed in the favor of those in the majority. In this segment, Indian Express's Deeptiman Tiwary joins us to talk about how the RSS has been pushing for the implementation of UCC. Deeptiman, could you begin by talking about what the editorial in the Indraprastha Samvad actually says?
In one of the magazines linked with the RSS, a few days back, there was an editorial which said that why is there a difference between laws which govern basically the civil life of Hindus and Muslims. For example, they say that when all criminal laws are same for everybody, why should there be different laws for marriages, for managing religious institutions, and several other facets of daily life? So their basic argument is that, look, this is one of the oldest issues of the Sangh Parivar, and it has been off and on pushing it through various forums. So it has been arguing through different platforms that why should mosques be managed by Muslims, churches be managed by Christians, and gurdwaras be managed by Sikhs, but temples be managed by the government? Why shouldn't temples and their treasury and everything, why should government be the custodian of it? Why shouldn't people be its custodian? So that has been one argument. Other is, of course, marriage, and we all know that there is a overarching politics around rights of women in marriage in India, and especially as far as the Muslim community is concerned.
Right, and like you said, this is not the first time that the RSS has called for the implementation of the UCC. But when did this issue become such a cornerstone of the Sangh Parivar's agenda?
Since the very beginning, Sangh Parivar has been a votary of common laws for everyone. And we all know it is also part of the constitution. It is something that is not implemented. This actually became a pivot of Sangh Parivar politics in the 1980s after the Shah Bano case, where the then Congress government actually took the matter to the parliament, brought in a new law, and superseded a Supreme Court order which gave rights of alimony to an old woman. And this became a huge political issue, and many also regard it as a mistake by the Congress because after that the tag of Muslim appeasement actually got stuck to the party, which it is trying to shed even till date. So since then it has been a huge issue, and Sangh Parivar has consistently pushed this agenda through every possible platform that it has had. Now that it is in power, so we have seen not only Sangh Parivar talking about it through different platforms, but even several BJP MPs have brought out private members' bill in parliament to implement UCC.
Right, and could you talk about this aspect a bit more, about how the BJP has been pushing for the implementation of the UCC?
Look, both the Sangh Parivar and the BJP, while there has been a lot of rhetoric around it, let's remember the BJP is in brute majority in parliament. If it wants to bring a law, nobody can stop it. It wanted to abolish Article 370. It did it within one day. So if it wants to do it, it can do it. But it is treading this path very, very gingerly and carefully. And the reason for that is that it's not as simple as removing Article 370, a law which actually did not have a very massive day-to-day life impact on people. Like you would have the rights that you have with or without Article 370 in Jammu and Kashmir. You bring a UCC at the central level, it is going to impact from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, everybody. So this is far more complicated. Also, it's not something that is only going to like a triple talaq law, which is only going to impact the Muslim community or any particular community. So this is something where, opinions from a very wider cross section of the society has to be taken for to arrive at any conclusion as to what if a UCC law should be there, what should be the form and shape of that law.
Right, and does the RSS push for any particular way that it thinks this should be implemented in the country?
As I said, that it's a very complex issue. However, the Sangh Parivar is of the opinion that it shouldn't be brought from the center because that could complicate things. And it should actually happen through states. So each state brings its own uniform civil code according to the situation and the cultural diversity that it has in that state. So we see that Uttarakhand has formed a committee which has sought suggestions on UCC, and it has already got thousands of suggestions and is currently considering them, and we will have to see as to what kind of law they actually come up with. Madhya Pradesh has already announced, another BJP ruled state has announced UCC, and it will be forming a committee, and it will follow the similar path. It is expected that other states, at least ruled by the BJP, will be slowly and steadily going through that road now.
Okay, and the push for UCC receives a fair bit of criticism from minority communities and civil rights groups. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, largely minority groups and civil rights groups have broadly made one simple argument that UCC, while as enshrined in the Constitution, has noble intentions, but the way it is being pushed by the BJP and the Sangh Parivar, it has only one agenda, and that is to target the minorities. That is to deprive them of their rights, to govern their lives according to their religious text. It is the same argument that was given about triple talaq law, where the minority community said that hardly anyone goes through triple talaq anymore. And this is not a very widespread practice. And by jailing, somebody who has given triple talaq, you're basically, what you're doing is you're offering his children, and who's going to take care of them. So all those issues were there, and they said that, you're basically doing this for vote bank politics and you're targeting the minority community. These are the kind of arguments that have largely been there from the opposition and minority communities about UCC as well.
You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Abhishek Kumar and was produced by Utsa Sermon, Anwiti Singh, and me, Shashank Bhargava. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.